It was an ordinary day at the private airport, where sleek jets rested under the sun and wealthy passengers moved freely, as if this grand terminal was their personal playground. The airport was known for luxury. Polished floors gleamed, and quiet music played softly in the background. It was a place where the powerful and privileged breezed through security without a second thought. Guards were used to smiling politely and waving through people who looked like they belonged. Today seemed no different, as people in designer suits and luxury clothes made their way confidently toward their private planes, each more extravagant than the last. But then Julia Parker arrived. Julia didn't walk with the same haughty swagger as most passengers. She carried herself with quiet confidence, an unspoken elegance that needed no announcement. She was a young black woman, dressed in a simple but well-chosen outfit, clean and crisp. Unlike the other passengers flaunting logos and designer names, Julia wore understated, classic pieces that fit her perfectly. She wasn't here to flaunt or show off. She was simply here to board her plane, just like everyone else. Yet, as she approached the security line, she could feel the atmosphere around her shift, a slight chill in the air that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was like the invisible warmth of welcome that greeted others had been reserved, replaced by a cautious, even suspicious silence. The security team, who had barely glanced at the others, suddenly seemed very interested in Julia. They exchanged quick looks with each other, silent but loud with meaning. One guard shifted his stance, crossing his arms in a way that felt more intimidating than protective. Another guard's eyes followed her every move as if waiting for her to do something wrong. She noticed it all, the shared glances, the brief smirks, the way their bodies subtly blocked her path. Julia felt like she was being judged without a single word being spoken. Her presence alone seemed to raise questions in their minds. Julia handed over her ID, calmly meeting the guard's eyes. He looked down at it, then back up at her, his face a mask of skepticism. It was a brief moment, but it said so much. He examined her ID more thoroughly than he had examined anyone else's. His fingers lingered over her documents, and he even brought out a magnifying glass to inspect her ID photo. The other guards gathered around, peeking over his shoulder, whispering in low voices that she could barely hear. Julia stood silently, watching them, and waited. She'd been in similar situations before, where people saw only the color of her skin or the simplicity of her outfit and thought that meant they could decide her worth. Other passengers, who hadn't noticed the security guards at all, began to look on with interest. People in designer coats with expensive luggage walked by, their curious glances resting on Julia and the unfolding scene. Some even slowed their steps, pretending to fix a strap or check a message. But in reality, they were listening, watching. Julia could feel their eyes on her, adding another layer of pressure. It was as if they, too, were questioning why she was here, as though her presence in this exclusive space was some sort of mystery or spectacle. The head guard finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure you're at the right terminal?" he asked, his voice filled with a hint of challenge. Julia took a slow breath, suppressing the urge to sigh. She had heard this tone many times before, the tone that questioned her without needing to ask an actual question. She gave him a polite smile, answering with a simple, "Yes, I'm sure." Her calmness seemed to bother him, as if he'd expected her to react with frustration or fear. Instead, Julia remained unflustered, keeping her dignity intact. Other guards joined in, each taking turns inspecting her papers, as if expecting to find a mistake, a flaw, a reason to turn her away. They treated her differently from the other passengers, almost like she was a problem to solve, something that didn't fit neatly into their world of luxury and privilege. Julia knew that this treatment wasn't due to anything she had done. It was simply because, in their eyes, she didn't look like someone who belonged in this world. She didn't wear the markers of wealth that they were used to seeing, and her calm, confident demeanor seemed to challenge their expectations. Time seemed to stretch as Julia stood there, waiting. She could feel the unease building in the guards, as if her quiet presence made them more uncomfortable by the second. She wondered if they were trying to unsettle her on purpose, to make her question herself or feel small. But Julia was not about to shrink under their gaze. She'd faced moments like this before, and each one had only strengthened her resolve. She met their stares without flinching, a steady look that said, "I know who I am." Finally, the head guard handed back her ID, still with an air of doubt. "We'll be watching," he muttered, as if his words were a warning. Julia simply nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She thanked him with a polite smile, and as she walked past, she could feel their eyes following her. She was used to this kind of treatment. The whispered judgments, the cold scrutiny, the expectation that she would somehow prove them right in their assumptions. Julia's steps were light but firm as she moved toward the boarding gate. She held her head high, knowing that whatever they thought of her, it didn't define her. She was here on her own terms, and nothing could take that away. The security team, however, seemed less sure. Their confident postures shifted subtly, as if they were slightly unnerved by the way she handled their silent interrogation without flinching or faltering. Julia didn't need to prove anything to them, but she knew that simply being here, calm and composed, was enough to challenge their expectations. Little did they know, Julia was more than they could imagine. She wasn't just another traveler. She wasn't here on a whim or by accident. She was here with a purpose, one that went far beyond what any of them could see. But for now, Julia let them wonder. She let them sit in their uncertainty, in their misguided assumptions. They didn't know who she was, and they certainly didn't know why she was there, but they would find out soon enough. As Julia walked toward the boarding gate, she couldn't help but notice a few passengers giving her side glances, curious but unsure. She saw the looks they exchanged, as if they were trying to piece together who she was and why she seemed so calm amidst the tension. Some looked intrigued, while others had expressions that held a faint trace of judgment, as if they, too, felt that she didn't belong. But Julia moved with purpose, ignoring their whispers and their questioning stares. She didn't owe them an explanation. The truth was, Julia was someone far more influential than they could ever guess. She had earned her place here, not by fitting into their expectations, but by forging her own path, overcoming challenges they couldn't even begin to imagine. And soon, they would see that the woman they had tried to dismiss so casually was far from ordinary. They would see that she was someone they'd regret underestimating. For now, though, she walked on, quiet, calm, and completely unshaken. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come out, before they would realize who she really was. And in that moment, Julia felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that soon the roles would shift, and those who had judged her would be the ones left in stunned silence. Julia felt the air change the moment she stepped forward. It was a prickling sensation on her skin, like a warning that told her she was entering hostile territory. She had experienced moments like this before, countless times, and each time had taught her how to keep her composure. She knew exactly what those around her were thinking, even though they didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Their body language, expressions, and sideways glances spoke louder than words ever could. This wasn't just a regular security check. She was being watched, judged, and tested. As she walked closer, the head of security stepped into her path, blocking her way. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl, the kind of face that never looked welcoming. His stance was rigid, almost as if he had been waiting for someone to challenge his authority. His eyes traveled from the top of her head to the tips of her shoes, slowly, as if he was searching for something wrong, something out of place. His gaze lingered on her clothes, her face, her calm expression, and Julia felt the full weight of his judgment. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind about her. "Miss, are you sure you're at the right terminal?" he asked. His tone was sharp, dripping with disdain, as though he found the very idea that she could be here laughable. His words were polite enough, but the way he said them was anything but. It was clear he didn't believe she belonged here. Julia met his gaze, keeping her face neutral, and offered a small, polite smile. She could feel the eyes of the other guards on her, watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Some of them even exchanged looks, as if sharing a silent joke. Without a word, Julia reached into her bag and pulled out her ID, handing it over to him calmly. The head guard looked down at the ID, his expression hardening as he studied it with an intensity that seemed unnecessary. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting every detail, as though expecting it to be a fake. His fingers ran over the edges, and he tilted it back and forth under the light, scrutinizing it, as if it might reveal some hidden flaw. Julia watched him in silence, her face betraying nothing. But inside, she felt the familiar sting of humiliation. The guard raised an eyebrow. Glancing back up at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. He seemed to take her calmness as some sort of challenge, as if her confidence made him feel the need to assert his authority even more. She knew that look well, the way he seemed annoyed that she wasn't intimidated by him, that she was standing there without fear. Julia knew he expected her to be nervous, to falter or hesitate, but she didn't give him the satisfaction. The other guards watched intently, some leaning forward slightly as though they expected her to make a mistake. Julia felt their eyes on her, judging her silently. She could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing down on her, assumptions that told her she didn't belong in this world of luxury and privilege. They didn't know her story, her journey, or the hard work that had brought her to this moment. All they saw was a young black woman who didn't fit into their narrow definition of who should be allowed to pass through this terminal with ease. The head guard let out a small, almost mocking chuckle. "And where exactly are you planning to go today, Miss Parker?" he asked, his tone dripping with doubt. He spoke her name slowly, as if saying it made her seem even less credible. Julia felt a surge of irritation, but kept her face calm, her voice steady as she replied, "I'm here for a private flight." She kept her answer short, not giving him any more information than necessary. She knew that sometimes, the less you say, the more power you hold. The guard looked back down at her ID, as if double-checking her words against the information on the card. "A private flight," he repeated, almost to himself, and she could see the disbelief in his eyes. It was as if he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that someone like her would be traveling this way. He handed her ID over to another guard, who inspected it just as thoroughly, and Julia stood silently, her expression unreadable. She had long ago learned that in situations like these, staying calm was the best weapon she had. The guards continued to examine her ID, passing it between them, as if it was some kind of mystery they needed to solve. Each one took turns scrutinizing it, flipping it over, and inspecting the photo. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing up at her, their eyes filled with skepticism. Julia knew that this was only the beginning. They were looking for any reason to question her, to delay her, to make her feel out of place. She had seen this behavior before, from people who were uncomfortable with her presence, who felt the need to put her in her place. The head guard finally handed her ID back, but his eyes held a warning. "We'll be watching," he said, his voice low and firm. Julia met his gaze, unflinching, and simply nodded, taking her ID back with a calm and steady hand. She didn't need to respond. Her silence was her answer. She turned away, walking toward the gate with her head held high, aware that their eyes were still on her. She could feel the tension in the air, the silent question that hung between them. Who does she think she is? As she walked, Julia felt the sting of their words and the weight of their stares, but she didn't let it show. She knew that they expected her to feel small, to feel out of place, but she refused to give them that satisfaction. She had worked too hard and come too far to let a group of guards with narrow minds make her doubt herself. She was here for a reason, a purpose that went beyond their limited understanding. And though they couldn't see it, Julia knew her worth. Every step she took felt like an act of defiance. She didn't look back at the guards, didn't acknowledge the whispers or the curious glances from other passengers who had witnessed the scene. She kept her focus on the path ahead, knowing that soon enough they would understand. Soon enough, they would see who she really was and why she was here. But for now, she let them wonder, let them stew in their assumptions and judgments. As she reached the gate, Julia took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. This was her journey, and no one else had the power to define it. The guards, the passengers, the whispers, all of it faded into the background as she reminded herself of her purpose. She was here for a reason, and that reason was far more important than the doubts or judgments of a few narrow-minded individuals. Julia knew that, in the end, her actions and her accomplishments would speak louder than any prejudice they held. So, with quiet strength, she moved forward, ready to face whatever came next. The wait seemed endless. Julia stood at the counter as the security team continued to check her documents. It should have been a quick process, a glance at her ID, a check of her boarding pass, and she would be on her way. But today, it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. Every second stretched longer, each moment filled with a growing tension that settled heavily in the air. She watched as other passengers moved past, breezing through security with ease. Some of them were laughing, chatting loudly, dressed in luxury from head to toe. Expensive bags, designer shoes, watches that sparkled under the airport lights. They looked like they belonged, like they had nothing to prove. And the guards? They'd barely glanced at them. A quick nod, a wave of the hand, and those passengers were on their way, moving freely without a single obstacle. But for Julia, things were different. Her papers were inspected with a level of care and scrutiny that felt more fitting for a crime scene investigation than a routine security check. One guard held her ID up to the light, tilting it back and forth, looking for something. Another guard examined her boarding pass, turning it over as if expecting to find hidden marks or invisible ink. They ran her documents through a scanner once, then twice, and then a third time, each scan seeming to take longer than the last. Julia could feel their suspicion, the silent message that said, "We don't trust you. We don't believe you belong here." Minutes ticked by, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Julia kept her expression calm, but inside, she felt a spark of frustration. She knew why this was happening, even though none of them would ever admit it out loud. They didn't see her as someone who could possibly be on a private flight, someone who could travel with ease and confidence. In their eyes, she was out of place, a puzzle that didn't fit, and they were determined to find a reason to hold her back. Other passengers noticed the scene unfolding, glancing at her as they walked by. Some looked curious, others indifferent, and a few seemed to enjoy the spectacle, as if watching her being held up by security was some kind of entertainment. Julia could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't let it show. She stood still, patient, and composed, waiting for the guards to finish whatever unnecessary steps they felt the need to take. Finally, one of the guards looked up, his face showing a mix of irritation and suspicion. "This is taking a while," he said, almost as if blaming her for the delay. Julia forced herself to smile politely. "I understand," she replied calmly. "These things happen." She knew that any sign of frustration would only give them more reason to doubt her, to see her as difficult. She couldn't afford to let them see even a hint of impatience. In moments like these, she had learned to keep her emotions hidden, to be as calm and still as possible, like a stone in a storm. As they continued to scan and inspect her documents, Julia took a quick look around. The passengers who had already been cleared were now seated comfortably, scrolling through their phones, sipping on coffee, chatting with friends. They had no idea of the struggle she was facing just to get past this simple checkpoint. To them, security was a minor inconvenience, a brief pause before they continued on their luxurious journeys. But for Julia, it was a battle. A silent, exhausting battle where she had to prove herself over and over again, just to move forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Julia spoke up. "I just need to make a quick call," she said, her voice steady but polite. She reached into her bag, her fingers closing around her phone. But as soon as she started to pull it out, one of the guards reacted quickly, stepping closer to her, his eyes narrowing with a look of caution. He didn't say a word, but his body language spoke volumes. It was as if he thought she might pull out something dangerous, something that would justify all the suspicion they had piled onto her. Julia raised an eyebrow, surprised by his reaction, but she kept her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm just making a call," she repeated softly, holding up her phone so he could see it clearly. She wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding, no reason for him to take her actions the wrong way. The guard watched her closely, his eyes sharp and untrusting, as if he still didn't quite believe her. Julia could feel the tension thickening, the unspoken doubt hanging heavily between them. She had never felt so scrutinized for something as simple as making a phone call. Little did he know, this phone call would change everything. Julia took a deep breath, steadying herself before she dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered on the other end. Julia kept her tone calm, her words clear. "Hello," she said, pausing for a brief moment. "I'm at the security checkpoint. Could you please let them know I'm expected?" She spoke with a quiet confidence, her voice carrying an air of assurance that was impossible to ignore. The guard's expression shifted slightly, a hint of uncertainty crossing his face as he listened to her conversation. He couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but he could see that Julia was speaking with someone important, someone who seemed to understand exactly what was going on. She kept her voice steady, her tone polite but firm, as if she was used to handling situations like this with grace and precision. She knew that this moment would change the way they saw her, that her calm response would speak louder than any protest or argument. When she ended the call, Julia put her phone back into her bag, her eyes meeting the guard's gaze without flinching. She could see the doubt flickering in his eyes, the realization that he might have underestimated her. For the first time, he seemed unsure, his confidence wavering as he struggled to reconcile his assumptions with the reality unfolding in front of him. Julia didn't say anything. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch between them. Moments later, another guard approached, his expression a mix of confusion and respect. He leaned in to speak quietly to the head guard, his words too soft for Julia to hear. She watched as the head guard's face changed, his initial skepticism replaced by a look of surprise. He glanced at her, his eyes widening slightly as he began to understand who she was, or at least that she was someone important, someone he hadn't expected to encounter. The guards exchanged quick looks, their expressions shifting from doubt to something closer to respect, even a hint of nervousness. Julia stood still, her posture relaxed but dignified, watching as they processed the new information. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke for her. She had no need to prove herself, no need to explain. The call had done that for her, and now they were left to confront their own judgments. Slowly, the head guard cleared his throat, his voice lacking the confidence it had held earlier. "Miss Parker," he said, his tone more respectful now. "I apologize for the delay." His words were stiff, formal, as if it pained him to admit that he had been wrong. Julia nodded, accepting his apology with quiet grace. She didn't hold any resentment. She had long ago learned to rise above moments like these. She knew that her actions and her calm response would speak louder than any anger or frustration. As the guard stepped back, allowing her to pass, Julia felt a sense of satisfaction, not from proving them wrong, but from staying true to herself, from handling the situation with the dignity and composure that defined her. She walked forward, her steps steady, her head held high, leaving the guards behind her with their lingering doubts and unspoken apologies. Julia knew that this was only the beginning of her journey, that there would be more challenges ahead. But she also knew that she had the strength to face them, that her quiet resilience would carry her through. She had proven, once again, that she was more than their assumptions, more than their doubts. She was someone who commanded respect, not through force or anger, but through her unwavering sense of self. And as she walked away, she couldn't help but feel a small spark of pride, knowing that she had stayed true to who she was, that she had let her actions speak for her. This moment, this small victory, was just one step in a larger journey, a journey that she knew would take her places far beyond the narrow expectations of those around her. The head of security's patience was wearing thin. He had checked Julia's documents multiple times, and though nothing was wrong, he couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that she didn't belong. The other guards exchanged glances, sensing his frustration. He clenched his jaw, his irritation visible, his stance tense. Julia stood calmly, but she could see that he was reaching his limit. He was about to say something, and she knew it wasn't going to be polite. Finally, he snapped. His voice was louder, sharper, and the sound echoed in the terminal. "Look, miss," he said, struggling to keep his tone in control but clearly upset. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you're wasting everyone's time. This terminal is for private flights only," he continued, emphasizing each word as if she hadn't heard him the first time. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "And if you don't have any legitimate reason to be here—" He didn't finish his sentence. His words hung in the air, thick with meaning, as if he expected her to turn around and leave, to admit that she was in the wrong place. Julia didn't move. She stood her ground, calm and collected, her gaze steady as she looked back at him. The guard's frustration grew with her silence, her lack of reaction, as though she was challenging him simply by being there, refusing to shrink away. But just then, something shifted in the terminal. From the far end of the hall, a group of people appeared, all moving together with purpose and importance. They were sharply dressed in tailored suits, walking briskly with an air of authority. Their presence was striking, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the terminal, and passengers glanced over, curious about who they might be. At the front of the group was a man who radiated confidence and power. He was well known in the business world. A CEO whose face regularly appeared on magazine covers, a person whose name held weight. His hair was neatly styled, and he wore a designer suit that looked like it had been made just for him. There was no mistaking his importance, and even the guards noticed, straightening up as they realized who was approaching. The head of security, noticing the group, shifted his attention for a moment, and his expression softened. These were clearly important people, people who belonged here, people who he respected. He even offered a slight nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of their status. But then, something unexpected happened. The CEO, the man leading the group, suddenly looked past the guards, past the other passengers, and his gaze landed directly on Julia. For a brief moment, his expression was unreadable, but then his face broke into a wide, genuine grin. His eyes lit up with recognition and excitement, and he raised a hand in a friendly wave. He quickened his pace, making his way over to her with a warmth that was impossible to miss. The guards watched in confusion, their eyes darting from the CEO to Julia, and back again, trying to piece together what was happening. As the CEO reached her, he didn't hesitate. He extended his hand, and Julia shook it, returning his smile with a calm, friendly expression. The CEO's voice was loud enough for everyone around them to hear, and there was no mistaking the respect in his tone. "Julia," he said with a chuckle, as though greeting an old friend, "we've been waiting for you. Everyone is here, all because of you. We couldn't have this meeting without the head of the board." His words echoed in the terminal, clear and unmistakable. The head of security froze, his face going pale as realization hit him like a wave. His mouth fell open slightly, and his eyes darted back to Julia, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. Julia, head of the board. The weight of his earlier words hung heavy between them, the memory of his harsh tone and assumptions now painfully clear in the light of the truth. He had spent the past several minutes questioning her, doubting her, treating her as if she was an intruder, only to find out that she held one of the highest positions in the company. She wasn't just a guest or a passenger. She was someone who commanded respect, someone with more power and influence than he could have imagined. The CEO continued speaking, unaware or perhaps ignoring the stunned expressions of the guards around them. "We wouldn't be here without you, Julia," he said warmly. "Your leadership has brought us to this point. Everyone on the team respects your vision, and we're all excited to see where you'll lead us next." His words were filled with admiration and pride, and Julia nodded in response, acknowledging his praise with a modest smile. She wasn't one to flaunt her power, but in this moment, she allowed herself to stand tall, to let her presence be felt. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, each of them clearly feeling the weight of their mistake. They looked at each other, then back at the head of security, whose face was still pale, his expression one of shock and embarrassment. He had spent the last several minutes challenging Julia, treating her with suspicion, and now he was faced with the undeniable truth. He had completely misjudged her. The CEO turned to the group of executives behind him, motioning for them to come closer. "This is Julia Parker," he said, introducing her with a smile. "She's not only the head of the board, but also the driving force behind our latest projects. I don't know where we'd be without her." The executives nodded in agreement, each of them looking at Julia with respect and admiration. They had come here specifically to meet with her, to discuss the next steps in their ambitious plans, and it was clear that they valued her expertise deeply. Julia glanced at the head guard, her expression calm, but her gaze piercing. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than words. The guard, realizing the depth of his mistake, swallowed hard, his face flushed with embarrassment. He managed a stammered apology, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Miss Parker," he said, his tone filled with regret. "I didn't realize. I didn't know." Julia gave him a small nod, acknowledging his apology without dwelling on it. She had no interest in holding a grudge or making a scene. She had come here for a purpose, and she wouldn't let this small incident distract her from what was truly important. But in that moment, the guard knew he would never forget this encounter. He had learned a lesson, one that would stay with him long after Julia had left. As the CEO and the executives led her toward the private lounge, Julia walked with quiet confidence, her step steady and assured. She felt a sense of calm satisfaction, not because of the guard's embarrassment, but because she had remained true to herself. She hadn't let his doubts shake her or make her feel small. She had shown strength in silence, dignity in the face of prejudice, and now she was exactly where she was meant to be, surrounded by people who recognized her worth. The other passengers in the terminal watched her go, some of them murmuring to each other, clearly intrigued by the scene that had just unfolded. They had witnessed a moment of revelation, a turning of the tables that left everyone with a sense of awe. Julia Parker, the woman they had underestimated, had shown them all what true power looked like, not loud or boastful, but quiet, steady, and unshakable. As they disappeared down the corridor, the head of security remained rooted to his spot, his face still pale, his eyes fixed on the place where Julia had stood. He knew that he would carry this moment with him, a reminder of the importance of humility, of never judging someone by appearances alone. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that respect was something owed to all, regardless of how someone looked or dressed. And as he watched Julia disappear into the distance, he felt a deep sense of regret, wishing he could turn back time and treat her with the respect she had always deserved. But for Julia, there was no need to look back. She had faced their doubts, their judgments, and had come out stronger. And as she continued forward, she knew that this was only the beginning. She would continue to lead, to inspire, and to prove that true strength lay not in appearances, but in the unbreakable core of who she was. In that single moment, everything changed for the head of security. All his previous confidence, his smugness, and the authority he had used to keep Julia waiting fell away in an instant. His posture softened, his shoulders slumped slightly, and the once steely look in his eyes turned into a mixture of nervousness and regret. His earlier hostility melted into an awkward politeness as he struggled to find the right words to say. For a moment, he stammered, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form a proper apology. The head of security, who only moments before had stood tall and proud, now looked like a man who had made a grave mistake. His face had turned pale, and a hint of embarrassment colored his cheeks as he looked down at the floor, clearly realizing the weight of his actions. "Miss Parker, I'm truly sorry," he managed to say at last, his voice quieter than before, lacking the boldness he had used when questioning her earlier. Julia looked at him with a calm, steady gaze, her expression unwavering. She didn't need to speak or respond to his apology. Her silence said everything. In her eyes, he could see that she understood exactly what he was feeling and knew that he was now fully aware of his error. Her presence alone, the quiet strength she exuded, was enough to make him feel the full weight of his actions. There was no anger in her face, no harsh words or accusations. She didn't need to stoop to his level or let his behavior get the best of her. She simply gave him a final look, one that was neither forgiving nor condemning, but rather a look of understanding. She knew that he would carry this moment with him, that he would remember the way he had treated her, and that this memory would stay with him long after she had left the airport. And with that, Julia turned away from him, leaving him to reflect on his own actions, to face the embarrassment and regret that now clung to him like a shadow. As she walked away to join the executives waiting for her, the head of security watched her go, feeling a pang of regret deep in his chest. He could feel the eyes of his fellow guards on him, their glances full of silent questions and perhaps even a bit of judgment. They had all witnessed his mistake, had seen him treat her with suspicion and doubt, only to learn that she was far more important than he had assumed. His behavior was now clear to everyone around him, and there was no way to hide from the truth. The other guards, too, looked at Julia as she walked away, a new respect in their eyes. They no longer saw her as an outsider, a stranger who didn't belong. Now they understood her true significance. She wasn't just another traveler or a random visitor. She was someone with power, someone who held a position of authority and influence, someone who commanded respect. Her quiet dignity had shown them all the importance of treating every person with respect, regardless of their assumptions. Passengers who had been passing by also took notice. Some of them had witnessed the exchange from the start, watching as the head guard had questioned and doubted her. And now they saw the stark contrast. They saw Julia, calm and composed, walking away without a hint of anger, while the head of security stood there, visibly shaken, the embarrassment clear on his face. In their eyes, Julia was no longer just another traveler. She was someone who had shown strength and grace, someone they would remember, and someone they would think twice about dismissing in the future. Julia continued walking, her steps confident and steady, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling within her. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or fight to prove herself. Her calm and collected response had been enough to reveal the truth. She had shown that true strength wasn't about overpowering others or making them feel small. It was about staying grounded, even when faced with doubt and disrespect. As she reached the executives, they greeted her warmly, smiles on their faces and respect in their voices. They had all been waiting for her, and now that she was with them, they were ready to move forward with the important meeting that had brought them all here. The executives looked at her with admiration, appreciating not only her role as the head of the board, but also the way she had handled herself with such poise and dignity. One of the executives placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a nod of encouragement. "Julia, you handled that well," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "Not everyone would have stayed so calm. It's no wonder you're the one leading us." Julia smiled in return, grateful for his support. She knew that moments like these could be challenging, but they were also a chance to show what true leadership looked like. As the group moved toward the private lounge, Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come here to do important work, to make decisions that would shape the future, and she wouldn't let this small incident distract her from her goals. Her journey wasn't about proving herself to strangers who doubted her. It was about staying true to her vision and leading with integrity. Behind her, the security team was left to reflect on what had just happened. The head guard, in particular, felt the sting of his own actions, the weight of his assumptions pressing down on him like a heavy burden. He knew that he would have to carry this memory with him, a reminder of the importance of humility and respect. He had learned a lesson that day, a lesson that would stay with him, reminding him to never again judge someone by appearances alone. The other guards, too, had taken note. They had seen Julia's quiet strength, her unshakable dignity, and they knew that she was someone to remember. She had shown them that true power didn't need to be loud or boastful. It could be quiet, steady, and resilient. And as they went back to their duties, they knew that they would carry this moment with them, a silent reminder of the respect that every person deserved. In the days that followed, the story of Julia's encounter with the security team spread among the airport staff. Word traveled quickly, and soon everyone knew about the woman who had shown such grace under pressure, who had turned an uncomfortable situation into a powerful moment of revelation. Julia's name became known, not just as a respected leader, but as someone who had reminded them all of the importance of humility and understanding. For Julia, this day was simply one of many in her journey. She had faced challenges like this before, and would likely face them again. But each time, she knew she was becoming stronger, more resilient. Each moment of doubt and judgment only reinforced her commitment to lead with compassion and respect. She had learned long ago that true power didn't come from forcing others to respect her. It came from earning that respect by staying true to her values. And as she moved forward, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had made a difference, not by demanding respect, but by showing what real respect looked like. She had left an impression on those around her, an impression that would last far longer than the frustration and doubt they had initially felt. In her own way, she had changed their perspective, one step at a time. This day, this experience, would stay with her as a reminder of her own strength and resilience. And for the guards, the passengers, and everyone who had witnessed her calm, quiet power, it would be a day they would never forget. Sometimes, life's greatest strength doesn't come from proving something to others. It comes from knowing, deeply and unshakably, who you are inside. Julia understood this well. She knew that while people might judge, assume, or even try to bring her down, none of those opinions could change her true self. For Julia, self-worth was not about gaining approval or earning someone's validation. It was about carrying an inner confidence, a belief in herself that was stronger than any doubt others might throw her way. As she walked away from that experience, Julia felt a deep peace within. She hadn't needed to fight or argue or defend herself with loud words. Instead, she had allowed her quiet strength to speak for her. This strength wasn't something that needed to be seen or acknowledged by others to be real. It existed within her, built through years of perseverance, hard work, and the countless moments where she had chosen to rise above the assumptions of those around her. And today was another reminder that, no matter what people might think, she knew her own worth. People would always judge based on what they saw. They would make quick assumptions based on appearances, believing that they understood everything they needed to know. But Julia had learned long ago that these snap judgments didn't define her, nor did they hold any real weight. People who judged by appearances often missed the truth entirely. They saw only the surface, the outer image, and missed the real person beneath. And usually, by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The person they had underestimated had already moved on, leaving them standing in their own mistaken assumptions. For Julia, each step she took was a testament to her journey, a journey of self-respect and quiet determination. She had built herself up, not through others' praise, but by facing life's challenges with resilience and courage. She understood that her identity, her strength, and her value were not for anyone else to determine. They were hers alone. And the more she faced situations like this, the more her own belief in herself deepened. Each experience was a reminder that she didn't need to change or hide who she was. She simply needed to stand tall and let her actions speak. Looking back, Julia felt a sense of gratitude. even for the hard moments. These experiences had taught her the priceless lesson of inner strength. She had learned that no one could shake her self-belief unless she allowed it. She had learned that the judgments of others were simply that, judgments, fleeting opinions that held no true power over her life. And in realizing this, she had found a kind of freedom that few people experience. She had freed herself from the need to prove anything to anyone but herself. And as she continued forward in life, Julia knew that she would encounter more moments like this one. There would be others who judged her, doubted her, and tried to place her in a box of their own making. But she also knew that she was prepared, that she had the tools to face whatever came her way with the same quiet grace and confidence that had guided her today. For her, these moments were simply chances to reaffirm her own worth, to show herself once again that she could rise above, that she could stay true to herself no matter what. Julia's experience was a reminder to everyone around her, even if they didn't realize it yet. She had shown them that strength wasn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who walk away with their dignity intact, unbothered by the small opinions of others. She knew that those who judged her based on surface impressions would eventually be left speechless, realizing too late that they had missed seeing the real person in front of them. In her heart, Julia carried a simple but powerful truth. True strength comes from within. It's not about making others see you. It's about seeing yourself clearly, about knowing who you are and standing firm in that knowledge. And in the end, that's all that really mattered. For those who took the time to look past appearances, who truly listened and saw beyond the surface, Julia was an inspiration, a reminder that real power, real courage, comes from within. And so, Julia walked forward, not with the need to prove anything, but with a quiet confidence, knowing that her path was hers to define. Those who judged her by appearances had missed out on knowing her strength, her grace, her story. And she knew that, in the end, they were the ones who would be left wondering, left speechless, while she continued forward, unshaken and unstoppable.